On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, container volumes are dropping. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. We're back at home headquarters here in beautiful North Carolina. It is a beautiful hot day outside. I know that because you can't see it, but I am soaking wet from sweat. Just came back from a fire call, volunteer firefighter for 23 years, and was directing traffic in 90 plus degree temperature out there for 2 hours. You will not see a realistic TV show about firefighters unless they give you an episode where for 1 hour they're just standing out there directing traffic, because that to me is what it's all about, being a firefighter some days. At least it was for me today. All right. Today we want to talk about a report that just came out from John McCowan, his latest report on the top 10 U.S. ports looking at containers. The headline of his story is this: 6.9% container volume decrease in May with bigger drops coming. So we're going to break down John's report and also talk about some other stories dealing with container trade in and around the world. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. So John looks at the top 10 U.S. ports, and what he's showing here is a 6.9% year-over-year drop in the month of May, with the latest month was a sharp reversal of both April's 9.6% gain and March's 11% gain. Now, remember, one of the things we talked about is there was a lot of front-loading happening with containers coming to the United States. May numbers are reflective of the initial tariff initiated by President Trump, and we're seeing the result of that, particularly on the West Coast ports. It will not be as pronounced on the East and Gulf Coast ports because of the longer sea transits, but we're going to break that all down for you here. So looking at some of the charts in John's work, this shows you the percentage of change in total U.S. inbound volume year over year. Now, he takes us back to 2017. And one of the things you see is that largely before COVID, that period from 2017 to 2020, we had a good kind of substantial growth in container volumes, almost anywhere between, a 0% growth to 10% growth. Where we see that first initial dip there is in early 2020. That is the impact of COVID and the disruption in the supply chain. But as everybody found themselves at home, we have that first massive peak there. That is the normal shipment of cargo coming across, plus with the shipments for COVID on top of that. And we see that begin to level off into 2022, a bit of an uptick again in 2022, and then that massive drop in 2023. What we see coming out of 2023 is that uptick into 2024. A lot of that is being caused by disruptions in the global supply chain. You have the Houthi diverting cargo around the Africa coast. We see an uptick in the economy in general during this period of time. But now what we also see in that period is a lot of front loading of cargo in late 2024 into early 2025. The chart shows you the volume of containers inbound TEU. Those are 20-foot equivalent units. Most of the containers you see coming down the road are 40-foot or FEUs or 2 TEUs. This shows you that measurement. Go back to 2017, 2018. We're just over 1.5 million boxes coming in usually each month. Get to 2021, we eclipse that. We get up to about 2 million boxes per month coming in. And by the end of 2024 into 2025, we're averaging that, about 2 million boxes per month coming into the United States. So where are those containers coming to? Well, back in 2017, the vast majority of them, over 50% of them, were going into the West Coast. And this chart shows you that downward trajectory of the percentage of cargo going to the West Coast versus the East and Gulf Coast ports. And as you notice on this chart, right around 2022 is when we hit the 50% mark, where as much cargo was going to the Gulf and East Coast as it was to the West Coast. And the reason for this downhill trajectory was a couple of reasons. Number one, the opening of the large Neo-Panamax lane in the Suez Canal, in the Panama Canal. It allowed much larger ships to go through. We also had issues on the West Coast with backlogs. Remember, 109 ships off of LA and Long Beach. You also had issues with the labor negotiations there. This is pre-ILA, East Coast, Gulf Coast. This is the ILWU on the West Coast. But what we began to see in 2024 is the reverse of that coming back. But notice this really deep drop here in April 25 down to one of the lowest levels we've ever seen, just over 44%. That had to do with the fact with the halting of cargo coming out of China, people stopping ordering, and that hit the West Coast first. And so what you see is a big precipitous drop there on it. We're going to see the flip side of that in the numbers for June on the East Coast as trade resumes when the tariff went down from 145 down to where it sits today. So let's take a look at John's chart here for May imports into the top 10 ports. Now, the biggest ports into the United States, there's a quartet of them. There's New York, there's LA and Long Beach, which are two separate ones, but they're right next to each other, so we tend to kind of group them together. Then there's Savannah, and then there's Houston, and then the tier below that is Norfolk, Charleston, Seattle, and Tacoma, and Oakland. But here you see that may change, and notice where you see the biggest drop. It is in LA and Long Beach. That's one of the most significant drops. Now, New York drops quite a bit too, down 9.1%, but it's LA and Long Beach. You see it. Savannah and Houston actually show a bit of an increase. When you look at the 3-month totals, that 3M total there, you see it's Los Angeles down 0.5%. That is the only one showing it over 3 months. If you look at the amount of cargo coming in those months prior to May, you see that uptick, particularly coming in the Savannah and into Long Beach. And then that 6Y chart there, that shows you the difference between 2025 versus 2019. That is the pre-COVID number that we're looking at. So you're definitely seeing a bit of a change here in terms of imports. So overall, what we're seeing coming into the ports in the month of May is about 1.8 million TEU coming in. So below that 2 million mark. Now, this is just the top 10 ports. You don't have the other ports included here. But again, those are a fairly smaller number. So we're definitely under 2 million TEU coming in May. Let's flip it over to imports. Now, imports substantially smaller than exports, only 840,000 containers. Remember, 1.8 million TEUs are imported, 0.8 million are exported. Where are we seeing that export take place? What are the big changes? Everyone is down except for Houston being up and Oakland being up. Everybody else is showing a negative, and particularly Long Beach is down. That should be negative 18.6. They are down. If you look at the 3-month percentage, notice how high Houston is, 10.2%. A lot of exports, particularly grain, heading out through the port of Houston. Also with Savannah, New York, where do you see those negatives? Largely on the West Coast, Los Angeles, and Long Beach. So we knew May was going to be a low month. There was no question about that. We heard horror stories about a 1/3 drop in the number of containers. We're not there yet. Remember, the prognosticators came out and sat there and said, trade has stopped from China. We're going to see a 1/3 drop, 35% drop in the amount of containers coming into the United States. Well, here we go. May numbers are showing a total drop in the top 10 U.S. ports as 6.9%. That's what we're seeing that drop being. Now, that is significant. I'm not undercutting that at all. But it's nowhere near as bad as what people were saying it was, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, we got alternate source of material from other places, Vietnam and other nations, India, Indonesia. There were a lot of other sources we did. There was that massive amount of front loading that took place prior to that. And even with the tariff on, there was no alternatives in some cases to get stuff from China. And so while it's bad, and we're going to see a bad June coming ahead here, that is going to impact. Now, John goes on here and talks about that the entire year potentially can be bad. We're going to see that. We'll have to wait and see the numbers. I keep going back to that kind of sine wave we see there with container volumes coming in. This is all over the place. I don't think we can predict that 2025 is going to be a bad year yet because of the amount of front loading we had, the amount of containers coming in, and still the volumes coming in. And that is reflective in these two stories right here. This one from FreightWaves, Stuart Chris, container rates from key U.S. trade partners plummet 39%. And in this story, Drewry, no lasting impact from tariff break as ocean rates fall again. So one of the other things we follow beyond the volumes is the cost to ship containers. So when you look at the Drewry index, this is the rate to move containers. What you see here is very similar. We get this massive sine wave. July of 2024, we see that big, huge peak there, and then we see it drop. It peaks back up again early in 2025, and then we just had this massive spike. I mean, massive spike that took place in June of 2025, but that massive spike gave way back to a return to normal. The two biggest ones you see right here are the orange, the Shanghai to Los Angeles, and the dark green, the Shanghai to New York. So we're back to where we are. And that just shows the volatility going on right now in ocean shipping. Because of tariffs, because we don't know what's going to happen from week to week, that creates the uncertainty, and uncertainty in shipping leads you to higher cost and higher volumes. All right, we got a couple other stories here I want to run past real quick to give this story from Maersk. Maersk estimates U.S. tariff averages 21% currently. So Maersk is estimating they're paying an effective U.S. import tariff on an average 21% relative to container load. This is less than half the rate before Washington paused its sweeping tariffs in April, the massive 135% to China. Maersk said in a regular global market update that at its peak, shortly after April 2nd, when President Trump unveiled tariffs against nearly all U.S. trading partners, the average effective tariff was 54%. Its estimate was based on the group's container-weighted effective average tariff rate metric. More than a dozen major U.S. trading partners are rushing to reach agreements with the Trump administration by a July 9 deadline. The company said it has seen robust container demand growth in the first half of the year. Quote, what played out was not completely unexpected. We did see customer advance orders ahead of the tariff announcements. Goes on, many apparel and fashion customers have now reached single-digit China dependency. In other words, they're getting a single-digit percentage of their goods from China. Goes on, other commodities like home improvements have a slightly higher level of Chinese manufacturing due to the nature of goods. This story from Mike Schuller, U.S. grain exports rise despite Chinese tariffs. So according to BIMCO, quote, during the first half of 2025, U.S. grain export shipments increased 9% year over year, driven by stronger maize exports. While an increase in import tariffs led to a 57% year-on-year drop in volumes to China, the U.S. has been able to find alternative markets for most of its cargoes. The impact was immediate and substantial. U.S. grain shipments to China fell from 26% of total exports in the first half of 2024 to just 10% in 2025. To compensate for that, American exporters pivoted to alternative markets across Asia, Latin America, and the Mediterranean. However, this shift couldn't fully offset losses in specific commodities. U.S. soybean exports dropped 10% year over year, while sorghum exports plummeted by 89%. Goes on here, quote, while the increase in volume was a positive for the dry bulk sector during the first half of 2025, ton miles is the distance a ton of cargo has to be shipped. Demand still fell 7% due to a 14% decrease in average sailing distances. New destinations for U.S. grains are on average closer to the U.S. than China. The other issue here is that a lot of that grain that goes to China has got to go through the Panama Canal. There are only 10 transits a day through the Neo-Panamax lane, the big lane of the Panama Canal. About 32 ships a day go through the Panama Canal. So it gets much more competitive to get in that big lane, and bulk carriers in particularly are competing for that big lane, but because of their type of cargo, it's high volume, low cost. It's really not economical for them to partake in the bidding process to buy a spot. So instead they sit and wait for their chance to go through. Next, we have a pair of stories. This one's over from Seatrade Maritime. FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, is launching an antitrust investigation into the World Shipping Council. U.S. shippers may not welcome FMC's antitrust investigation as Trump administration takes a more aggressive stance against shipping. And then this from FreightWaves, U.S. Maritime Chief, not a big fan of ocean carriers' approach as agency reviews antitrust immunity. So this is kind of a parting shot from the FMC chairman, Louis Sola, who stepped down as of June 30th. His term expired, and now we have a Federal Maritime Commission with just 3 commissioners on it, where it's short 2. Sola said this in the story, quote, I'm not a big fan of the World Shipping Council and their approach. I've been very vocal on this always. Rather than work with us on rulemaking Congress tasked us to do in the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, they sued us in federal court. So Louis Sola is a big advocate for basically more expanded role for the FMC, and we've seen that. There are right now investigations going on about open registries. There's an investigation going on about choke points, and now here's one about the World Shipping Council. This all goes down to an issue about whether or not the large shipping companies, again, the top 10 shipping firms, control 85% of the container space afloat. They are organized into 4 conferences. And again, they're not cartels. They will tell you they're not cartels. They're not. I mean, they're not cartels, but they do some cartel stuff they're kind of, they do things. And, it's amazing that when one all of a sudden levels a surcharge, the other one does. And they seem to know what each other is doing, even though there's no coordination between them. Again, it's just a vessel sharing agreement, but at times it kind of smells like a cartel. And so what the FMC wants to do is do an investigation into this. Now, this has been done before. It hasn't gone very far, I will tell you. However, there is a renewed interest in taking a look at this. And the World Shipping Council has been a very interesting organization. I've talked about them quite a bit. I think number one, the name, the World Shipping Council, has a Dr. Evil sound to it. I don't like it. It sounds like some sort of nefarious organization. But in truth, they do some great work. They do some good information. They're a lobby group. They lobby for ocean shippers. And that's nothing wrong with that. I mean, every industry has lobbyists. There's nothing out of the ordinary about it. The problem becomes in that they represent a group that has a kind of a stranglehold on U.S. imports and exports. And during the supply chain crisis, it became very vocal, especially when U.S. exporters were trying to get their goods out of the United States and they couldn't. Instead, the shipping companies were prioritizing taking empty containers back to Asia to load them up, to bring them back at a higher rate than they could the empty containers heading out, or even with American exports in them. And so this is an issue that probably does require an investigation. I think the World Shipping Council should be careful about how they tackle this. They don't want to go too much against what the FMC is doing. Right now, it's just a kind of a fact finding. And so I would let them fact find and see what they come up with. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you can hit the super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I'm going to go and dry my shirt off because it literally has been soaking wet this entire... I probably should have changed before I came in, but the air conditioning feels good in here, and it was really, really hot outside. Listen, there's nothing better than directing traffic on a hot highway with diesel and gas exhaust sucking it in. Again, when you see a firefighter or, a first responder directing traffic, be nice to them. Say thank you. Just be polite. Don't yell at them. They really don't want to be there as much as you don't like them being there. Till the next episode, this is Sal, signing off.